We're about to journey down a cobblestone road into 1892 Fall River, Massachusetts. It would be an honor and a privilege for you to join us. And we have a special invitation to extend. Post your own theories below, and in a few weeks, we'll do a follow-up episode and report your ideas. We'll give proper credit, of course, using your screen name. Hope to see you in the comments section. The only real basis for the Lizzie did it theory is the matter of opportunity. It was extremely hard for an intruder to spend all that time in the house and yet not be seen by Bridget or Lizzie. Now, no one suspected Bridget at the time, and we don't suspect her now. She had no motive, and nothing about her testimony or actions seems unusual. But other than the problem of opportunity, there's actually no convincing evidence against Lizzie. There are 4 lines of evidence that sway most people in the Lizzie did it camp: the burned dress, the Prussic acid, Lizzie's inconsistent statements, and the note that supposedly came from a sick friend of Abby's. We're going to take a close look at each of these, and we're going to show that the first 3 of them don't really tell us anything. They don't add to one side of the debate or the other. And then we'll get to the note, and we'll ask the question that will unlock a whole new world of possibility. This is the note that Lizzie claimed came to Abby that morning from a sick friend requesting help. Such a note was never found, nor was any sick friend asking for aid. No messenger that was sent to the Borden house. If Lizzie invented this note, there's almost no way she's not involved in the killings. What no one has ever asked before is this: who else might have invented this note? The answer to that question is actually kind of obvious. Join us on this little journey. There's a really interesting thing that happens when you study the details of the Borden case closely and then start looking into other unsolved murders. Very soon you start to see how easy it is to make false assumptions about a lot of things, or how often evidence can seem really impressive until we learn the conclusions it leads to are actually impossible. Have you ever seen the evidence that the moon landings were faked? The amazing thing is that on its face, the evidence can actually seem quite convincing. Maybe you've seen the photo of the American flag being planted. It looks like it's fluttering, which would be impossible on the moon since there's no atmosphere and no wind. But we did land on the moon. With a powerful enough telescope, you can actually see the evidence. Not only that, the astronauts placed a reflector there, which anyone with a laser today can use to take a distance measurement. So how does the flag in the images seem to flutter? What matters is that it is explained. NASA can't explain it. But this isn't always the case in unsolved murders. Sometimes bad evidence isn't disproved. Sadly, it was not uncommon for innocent people to be executed for murder. Sometimes we can look back and see with something close to certainty that they got it wrong, and yet we'll still see this convincing evidence on which the accused was convicted. How does this happen? False witnesses, false confessions, dubious physical evidence, poor investigative techniques? It can be hard to tell all these years later. When there's a murder in the community, there is a lot of shock and outrage. The public is inflamed. There's immense pressure on the police and the prosecutors. People not only want to see these cases solved for the sake of justice, but not knowing what happened makes us feel unsettled and anxious. For example, Jack the Ripper, the son of Sam, or the Boston Strangler. Not knowing why the victims are killed or how they're chosen is as much a problem as not knowing the identity of the killer. If the killer has no rhyme or reason, then we might be next, or maybe someone we love. But there's also a basic human need to fit things into a narrative. Narratives are how we understand the world around us. Our brains work by fitting everything we experience into some pattern that's been seen before. This is true from our basic sensory inputs to more complex events. An image reaches your eye, and your brain tries to match it up with something similar it's seen before. In fact, when it comes down to it, that's what a brain is: a pattern recognizer. Narratives are just more complex patterns. I challenge you to do this. Look very closely at the evidence in the Borden case. Then spend some time looking at other unsolved cases. Look at the trials in many of those cases that either ended up in acquittal or false convictions. Look at the way bogus evidence inflamed opinion, or evidence that seemed very convincing, and often still does now, even though we know it's not true. If you examine a lot of cases, one thing I'm certain of: when you come back to the Borden case, you won't quite look at this evidence the same way ever again. Let's look at the burned dress. The murders took place on Thursday. Once police arrived, they were always present until Lizzie was jailed in the following week. Within a couple of hours of Andrew's murder, police fingered Lizzie as their main suspect and were searching the entire house for evidence, and of course for the murder weapon. They also searched the barn, the yard, and neighboring yards. In the following days, there were several more searches, and these searches were highly organized and very determined. Carpenters and masons were brought in, septic pits emptied, the chimney searched, wood piles moved, wallpaper pulled, a pond dragged, and so on. They were sure Lizzie was the killer, and they were determined to find the evidence. They found nothing. On Sunday morning, Alice Russell came into the kitchen and found Lizzie shredding a dress. Nearby in the sink room, Emma was washing dishes. Lizzie proceeded to burn the shredded pieces of dress in the stove. When questioned by Alice, Lizzie explained that the dress had been ruined by paint. Emma affirmed this. Later, this would bother Alice enough that she went to the police with her story. Looks pretty incriminating, doesn't it? But what is the theory here? That Lizzie changed into the paint-soiled dress, killed Abby, changed out of the damaged and now bloody dress, then put it back on when Bridget went for a nap so she could kill her father, then changed out of it again, hid the dress where police couldn't find it despite multiple searches, then burned it on Sunday morning when the cops were just outside the door? Or did she wear multiple dresses, hide them all, then burn them all? At trial, Emma testified that several weeks prior, the dress had been spoiled by paint. Lizzie had been supervising contractors hired to paint the interior. The dressmaker employed by the Bordens also testified to the existence of this ruined dress. Emma said she had been on Lizzie's case for weeks to destroy it. So was burning old clothing in the stove normal back then? Actually, yes. There was no town rubbish removal service in those days. The first city to establish such a department was in Brooklyn, New York, 6 years later. Back then, there were private peddlers who picked up certain waste products. For example, every town had a rag and bone man. In fact, these still existed in the US right up until the 1970s. With a horse-driven cart, the rag and bone man went around collecting these items, which he sold to paper and soap manufacturers. But most citizens simply burned what could be burned. And in a time before plastics, most material could be burned. If you wanted to dispose of paper, you threw it in the stove. Same with wood, and the same with clothing. Think of Dr. Bowen burning the note in the Borden stove on the day of the murders. You might wonder if Lizzie could have worn the paint-damaged dress during the killing. The problem with this theory is that the dress was very visibly damaged by paint, and Bridget didn't observe Lizzie to be wearing it. She testified that Lizzie did not change her dress at all during that morning. According to Emma and Lizzie, the paint-damaged dress had been hanging right out in the open on a nail when the police had searched the house. But the police testified they didn't see any dress damaged by paint. This leaves two possibilities. Either the police, in their multiple searches, failed to find the paint-damaged dress, or they found the dress, spotted no blood on it, and therefore considered it not suspicious, and then later fudged their testimony to say they never saw the damaged dress. Sadly, we suspect the latter, because there were numerous instances of police fudging evidence, including with the hatchet the prosecution presented at the trial. Why would police do this? The same reason they always do in these high-profile cases. Because a narrative had formed. Narratives are fickle. The mood sweeping the public can shift back and forth in some new direction. Newspaper accounts have a lot to do with this, but also just plain old rumors. By the time of Lizzie's trial, the public mood was that she was innocent. But in the week after the murders, the prevailing narrative was that Lizzie did it. All they lacked was, evidence. Then came Alice Russell to the rescue with her story of a dress burning. Aha, we got her. It was under that enormous pressure that police testified. Not surprisingly, none of them remembered seeing the paint-damaged dress hanging right out in the open on the hook. The burned dress became a key piece of evidence that allowed the prosecution to indict Lizzie a week after the murders. A final word on this burned dress. The jury heard the prosecution's testimony on the dress. The jury also heard the defense's witnesses, Emma and the dressmaker. And the jury acquitted Lizzie in about an hour. Next on the list of reasons most people think Lizzie did it is the supposed attempt to purchase prussic acid, a form of cyanide. This evidence was not allowed by the judge to be used at trial, but people in the Lizzie did it camp remain powerfully swayed by it. We're not. Eli Bentz, a drugstore clerk, testified that Lizzie came into his store the day before the murders and asked to buy prussic acid. She claimed she wanted to use it to remove moths from a sealskin coat. And indeed, the drug was widely used as an insect fumigant. Bentz didn't know Lizzie, had never seen her before. Two of Bentz's friends in the store with him at the time backed up his claim. Naturally, the implication is that Lizzie was trying to buy poison in order to kill her parents. No poison was ever found in the house. The stomachs of the murder victims were tested, as was the milk, and no poison was found there either. Was Bentz telling the truth? Did he remember correctly? The day before the murders, hours before Lizzie supposedly visited this drugstore, Abby visited Dr. Bone. She told him that everyone in the house was suffering from a bad stomach illness, and that she suspected someone was actually trying to poison them. Please note the chronology here. Abby visited the doctor in the morning, and Lizzie supposedly went into the drugstore later. Of course, Lizzie would not have been shopping for poison if she already had obtained it and was poisoning them. Later that same night, and this was the night before the murders, Lizzie would tell Alice Russell something similar, that they suspected someone was trying to poison the household. What we have here seems to be the mother of all coincidences. Abby believes someone was trying to poison them, but no poison was ever found. Yet the next day, Abby and Andrew were killed. Why did Abby suspect someone was poisoning them? Why did Lizzie mention the same suspicion to Alice? The animosity in that house at that time must have been sky high. No one tried to poison the Bordens. Clearly there was just a stomach bug going around. It spread from Abby and Andrew to Lizzie and Bridget. John Morse's niece in the home Morse visited the next morning had also been sick. In fact, she had sent for Dr. Bone. A neighbor of the Bordens testified that a short time before the murders, she had been walking from downtown when illness forced her into the yard right next to the Bordens. When you gotta go, you gotta go. Yet this was not known to Abby Borden the day she visited Dr. Bone. The stomach bug must have been pretty severe. She concluded someone was trying to poison them. There's no indication Abby suspected Lizzie. Bridget would later testify that relations were normal and civil inside the home. An acquaintance of Lizzie's reported her saying that her stepmother was deceitful, saying one thing to her face and another to her back. So it seems whatever hostilities were brewing in the family were kept simmering just beneath the surface. Things were civil, but there was underlying tension. If you think that feels like how your home can sometimes be, I'm sure you're not alone. When people live together many years, there's underlying tension and friction. Sometimes it boils over and spills out in conversations people have outside of the home. But the coincidence here is tantalizing. We have suspicion of poisoning only 24 hours before the murders. Maybe you don't believe in coincidences, right? Well, we tend not to either. And that's why we don't put any weight on the testimony of the drugstore clerk. Imagine Fall River that hot afternoon. Within hours, rumors are sweeping across the city. The first headlines come in the 2 p.m. edition. Most normal activity in the city grinds to a stop. Even the factories spill out early. This was the biggest story of their lives. Among the rumors would have been word of a possible poisoning. Dr. Bone and Alice Russell had talked about the suspicions of Abby and Lizzie the day before. At the same time, very early on, Lizzie became the main suspect. So on the one hand, you have rumors of Lizzie killing her parents. And on the other hand, you have the rumors of attempted poisoning. Is it really any surprise that in this environment, someone tried to connect those dots? And again, we see the world in narratives. Our brains exist to connect information into patterns. In big cases like this, there's also a tremendous desire for many in the public to become part of events. Thousands of letters come in with all kinds of extravagant claims, including outlandish confessions, cockamamie theories, and witness claims that later proved impossible. One crazed man even tried to turn himself in as the killer of the Bordens, but it turned out he was nowhere near the scene of the crime. We see this kind of thing in big modern cases too, such as the JFK assassination, the Oklahoma City bombing, or 9/11. Thousands of crazy claims come in from the public. Most get dismissed. This was true in the Borden case too. But the Benz claim was not dismissed because it fit the narrative. It fit what police had already concluded about the identity of the killer. So the police paid Bentz a visit, and they did something very strange by modern standards. Bentz didn't know Lizzie, but he told police he would remember the woman if he got to see and hear her in person. So the police took her, in secret, to the Borden home, and while Lizzie was in the kitchen talking to the police, they snuck Bentz into the sitting room. He got a quick peek, he listened to her voice, and gave the police exactly what they wanted. Bentz's testimony proved crucial in getting the indictment. The test results for the victims' stomachs and the milk had not yet come back. So everyone expected those results to show poison. But then the results finally came in after the indictment. No poison. So what do we do with this testimony about prussic acid? There's just no way of knowing the truth here. Maybe Lizzie really did come into the store and try to buy poison. Maybe she was unable, despite her wealth and connections, to buy it anywhere. Or maybe some other woman, perhaps even weeks before, had come into the drugstore. And Bentz, eager to be a part of the crime of the century, simply misremembered. Bentz said that it was extremely rare for someone to buy prussic acid. This proved not true. Records showed it was commonly bought in all of the city's many drugstores. Why would he lie about this? Remember the pressure he was under by this point to support the exploding narrative. When it comes to witness testimony, that's what we'll see in this case and in pretty much every case. Witnesses tend to not only color their testimony in the direction of the prevailing theory of the moment, but their minds tend to shape the very memories that form in their own heads. When I was a kid, UFOs fascinated me. As I became an adult, I grew pretty skeptical, but I still found a good UFO story to be entertaining. Now, I have not seen a lot of reports or images that strike me as compelling. But one thing that does seem really interesting is testimony from commercial airline pilots who report seeing a giant mother ship. These are rare, but there are a few documented cases. There are two things that make them compelling. First, the witnesses are very credible. They're in the sky all of the time, and since they have hundreds of lives in their hands every day, they tend to be very responsible. Second, there are two witnesses, the pilot and the co-pilot. But this leaves us with a conundrum. Why are these reports so rare? Did these pilots catch the mothership in a moment when its cloaking device was off? Maybe. But the more likely explanation is a phenomenon we have to keep in mind when looking at unsolved murders. What likely happened is that one of the pilots, who was normally perfectly credible, turned and saw a rare cloud formation. His brain, trying to fit things into a recognizable pattern, matched it to some image he had of a mother ship. Wasn't a conscious decision. His brain just did it. That's what brains do. So he turned to his co-pilot and said, "My God, do you see that?" This planted the suggestion in the co-pilot's brain that there was something so incredible it could hardly be believed. His brain was already in a highly suggestible mode as he turned to look at the rare cloud formation. His brain was already conjuring up some kind of craft as he looked at the strange cloud. Our minds are very suggestible. This can explain how corroborating witnesses also end up describing things that didn't really happen. When you go back and look at old murder cases, especially ones that really seized the public's attention, people like Eli Bentz emerge almost inevitably. Often there are corroborating witnesses. Bill James has recently published a book called The Man from the Train about a serial killer in the early 20th century. He details numerous cases. Take the murder of the Cassaway family in San Antonio in 1911. All 5 family members were murdered in their sleep, which, by the way, is a strange phenomenon that seems to appear over and over again, a topic of an upcoming episode of ours. So all 5 sleeping family members of the Cassaway family were killed with the blunt end of a heavy axe. Local police were puzzled. Why did no one wake up? A saloon keeper claimed Cassaway showed up around 11 p.m. and purchased a bucket of beer to take home. The theory was that this was how the family was drugged and why they never woke up. Newspapers went wild with this salacious report. But the idea was absurd. Cassaway rarely drank alcohol. His wife didn't drink at all. Certainly his young children didn't. A heavy rain had started that night around 11 p.m., but there were no signs of anyone tracking mud through the front door, which Cassaway would have used. To accept the saloon keeper's testimony, you have to believe that Cassaway went out in the rain late at night, bought a bucket of beer to take home, allowed someone to slip a sedative into that bucket, then shared it with his family, including his children, who were aged 6, 3, and 5 months, and who also never woke up. As with the prussic acid, no evidence of poison was ever found. This kind of false witness testimony pops up in almost every case, and sometimes it even results in someone innocent being executed. Cassaway was a very well-known figure in his community. How did the saloon keeper make such a big mistake? We can't know. Maybe he confused him with another patron. Maybe Cassaway came in on some other night. Maybe the saloon keeper just wanted to insert himself into the case. It happens in almost every notorious unsolved murder. Narratives form, and witnesses come out of the woodwork with stories that fit those narratives. Remember, investigators under extreme pressure are out scouring the community for testimony that supports their prevailing theory. And a once-in-a-lifetime excitement is sweeping the public, the chance to be a part of the story of their lives. Which is why witness testimony that is not backed by physical evidence is generally very unreliable. And it doesn't add up to anything here either. The third line of evidence that people point to when concluding Lizzie was guilty was her inconsistent statements. First, we have what people on the scene reported her saying that day. Bridget, Mrs. Churchill, Alice Russell, Dr. Bowen, Uncle Morse, and the cops all spoke to her. We also have Lizzie's own testimony at the inquest, held about a week after the murders. Under the rules of the time, that testimony could be forced at an inquest hearing, and she had no right to defense counsel. But the prosecutors still used every trick in the book in order to trip her up. She actually held up pretty well, but there were little inconsistencies. The question left to us is whether this is due to confusion or to lying. For example, when asked where she was when her father got home, her answer varied. She said she was upstairs putting away clothes, or she said she was coming down the stairs, or in the kitchen reading an old magazine. Much is made of these little differences. But does it really show an attempt to deceive? Or does it just reveal confusion and imperfect memory about mundane events? She testified that she'd brought clothing upstairs to put away, basted a loop on a shirt, and then went back down and went into the kitchen to read a magazine. According to her, she was only in her bedroom 5 minutes. Is there really anything suspicious about this? Let's play it out from both angles, guilt or innocence. For the Lizzie did it crowd, these inconsistencies prove she's lying about killing her parents. Because if she's untruthful about the little things, like where she was when her father came home, it has broader implications. Bridget testified Lizzie was upstairs when Andrew came home, perhaps moving towards the stairs. The prosecution wants us aware that Lizzie was upstairs alone with the corpse of Abby. But Lizzie never denied being upstairs. In her statements, she either was upstairs and came down shortly after Andrew came home, or had come down just before he came home, or somewhere in between. A lie about this wouldn't gain her anything, since in any version of her testimony, she admits to being upstairs for a short period. If Lizzie was completely innocent, it's not surprising she couldn't remember whether she was in her room, about to come down, on the stairs, or in the dining room. Her mind didn't take much notice of where she was when her father came home because it was just an ordinary everyday incident. This is how it went with most of her statements. Slight discrepancies that can be just as much chalked up to confused memory as to a guilty person trying to keep their story straight. So in our view, the burned dress, the prussic acid, and the minor inconsistencies in her statements don't really tell us anything. They don't add weight either to the Lizzie did it side or to the Lizzie didn't. But there is one claim Lizzie made, a claim which is very likely false, which does add a crucial clue: the mysterious note. Lizzie claimed that Abby told her a sick friend had sent a note requesting her help. No such note was found. No friend was identified who requested her help. The first mention of a note is Lizzie telling her father, who had just returned, that Mrs. Borden had received it from a sick friend. We know this because Bridget overheard the conversation. At the moment Lizzie was telling her father this, Abby was lying dead upstairs in the guest room. A few minutes later, Lizzie was setting up her ironing boards in the dining room. Bridget was finishing up the window wash. According to Bridget's testimony, Lizzie told her, if you go out, be sure to lock the door, for Mrs. Borden has gone out on a sick call, and I might go out too. Bridget asked who was sick. Lizzie said she didn't know. Must be someone in town. At the inquest, Lizzie testified that Abby had told her of the note. But again, no note was found, and no one came forward claiming to have sent one. No messenger came forward either. Emma and Lizzie would hire a private detective and put out a reward, but nothing turned up. If indeed Lizzie invented the note, that certainly suggests guilt. But let's take a closer look. According to Lizzie, Abby told her she was going out to visit a friend who had sent the note, and that she'd stop and buy the food for dinner on the way home. She asked Lizzie what she might want. Please notice this little bit of evidence, because every other investigator seems to ignore it. It was Abby who went out almost every morning to buy the day's food supplies. So the question is this: why would Lizzie invent the note? How would it benefit her? The guilty theory is that Lizzie invented the note in order to account for Abby's absence. It said she needed to explain this to Andrew when he got home. However, wouldn't the fact that Abby went out every day to buy the groceries have been enough to explain it? Even if a trip to buy groceries might normally take Abby only 20 minutes or so, it was not uncommon for Abby to visit her half-sister or do some other shopping downtown. What need was there for Lizzie to invent a note story? All she had to tell Andrew and Bridget was that she had gone out as usual for the grocery shopping and hadn't yet returned. When it comes to selling a lie, an important technique is to use as much truth as possible and sprinkle it only with the bare minimum of lies necessary to create the fiction. Any con man knows this. Even someone with no experience of creating big lies would be smart enough to know this intuitively. So let's assume that Andrew arrives home and asks where Abby is. Lizzie doesn't want him to go looking for her around the house because Abby's corpse is lying upstairs. So Lizzie simply says she hasn't returned from shopping yet. Maybe Andrew replies, that's funny, she should be home by now. Lizzie just shrugs and says she must be visiting someone. End of story. There's no need to invent a note. There's no need to invent a story about a sick friend. Never tell more lies than you need to in order to make the bigger lie work. Most people assume there are two possibilities here. Either a note really did come, and Abby destroyed it in the stove, and for some reason neither the person requesting help nor the messenger could ever be located. Or Lizzie made it up. But there is a third possibility. Have you thought of it? If there was no note, if no one had requested Abby's help, was there any other person who could have invented this besides Lizzie? 120 years have gone by. Countless people have been fascinated by this case, but sometimes no one asks the obvious questions. This is the first of the two questions we promised you in part 1 that would unlock the whole mystery. Are you ready? Who else could have invented the story about Abby getting a note to help a sick friend? There's only one other person: Abby Borden. Thank you for joining us on our journey down a cobblestone road into 1892 Fall River. In the next episode, we're going to take you to an even darker and stranger place: the mind of a serial killer. Your support means everything to us, so please click subscribe. Those of you with a particularly generous nature might be willing to click like. And to show our appreciation, join the conversation below and we'll have a narrator mention you on a future show.